felt a very specific kind of anger, not the explosive kind, the quiet, unsettling kind that sits in your stomach and refuses to leave. It started when I read a document published in 2007 by the International Theological Commission. It is called The Hope of Salvation for Infants Who Die Without Being Baptized. The title sounds gentle, pastoral, merciful even. But when you read what it actually does, the gentleness vanishes. With a few pages of carefully crafted bureaucratic theology, it effectively deleted an entire realm of the afterlife. It took Limbo, a place that terrified millions of people for centuries, and quietly archived it. No press conference, no apology tour, just a document uploaded to a server in the Vatican. A myth quietly discarded. And that was the moment the anger set in. Because if they can just delete a part of the afterlife with a stroke of a pen, you have to ask the obvious question. Does God actually make the rules, or do men? This was not just some obscure academic debate. For generations, this was a non-negotiable spiritual reality that broke people. If you were a mother in Ireland or anywhere in Catholic Europe, and your baby died before reaching the baptismal font, the church told you that your child was excluded from heaven, blocked by the stain of original sin. They were sent to limbo. You were not allowed to bury your own child in consecrated ground. Imagine that for a second. Imagine the physical reality of that. Men would take the babies in the dead of night to unconsecrated boundaries, places they called cillíní, and bury them in secret. A father carrying a small wooden box through the dark in the freezing rain, walking to the edge of a parish boundary or a crossroads or an abandoned ruin, because the priest had locked the cemetery gates, and the mothers were left behind in the house, physically empty, spiritually shattered, left to carry an agonizing grief. They believed their children were trapped forever in a spiritual waiting room, exiled from the face of God. All because of a rule. A rule that in 2007 the institution simply decided was no longer necessary. So, if my ancestors suffered immense grief over unbaptized babies for a doctrine that was not even real, is anything they teach eternal? Or is it all just policies they update when it becomes unpopular? That is what I could not stop thinking about. I could not sleep. I needed to understand how an entire dimension of eternity is born, enforced, and then quietly dismantled without anyone being held accountable. I spent the next 3 weeks digging into how this happened. And what I found was not a story about divine revelation. It was a story about architecture. The architecture of power, and how institutions build theological structures to solve their own bureaucratic problems, regardless of the human cost. Let me back up. To understand how Limbo was deleted, you have to understand why it was built in the first place. You have to go back to the Council of Florence in 1442. This is where the tension begins. You have to picture these men sitting in council chambers, defining the exact topography of the universe. The council declared that souls departing in original sin descend immediately into hell. Those are the exact words. They descend immediately into hell, though to be punished with disparate punishments. This created a massive theological problem, a terrifying one. If a baby dies without baptism, they still carry original sin. Therefore, according to the Council of Florence, they cannot enter heaven. But sending an innocent infant to suffer the eternal flames of hell felt instinctively wrong, even to medieval theologians. It offended their basic human sense of divine justice. It was a PR nightmare before PR existed. So they had a problem. The doctrine they created had trapped them in a corner. They needed a loophole. And that is exactly what Limbo was. a theological hypothesis, a concept constructed by medieval thinkers to solve a contradiction they had created themselves. It was not in the scriptures. Jesus never mentioned it. The early apostles never preached it. It was a patch in the software, a way for theologians to say, yes, the babies are technically excluded from heaven, but no, they are not suffering in flames. They are in a state of natural happiness, just without the vision of God. It was an intellectual compromise designed to balance an equation in their own theological system. But when you are a grieving mother holding a lifeless infant, a theological compromise does not feel like mercy. It feels like a life sentence. I was staring at my screen at 2 in the morning, reading diocesan records about these cillíní in Ireland, and I felt physically sick. I wanted to close the laptop and go to sleep. I almost gave up here. The weight of all that unacknowledged grief was too much. You read about these places, these boundary lands where thousands upon thousands of infants were buried in the dark, undocumented, uncelebrated, treated like spiritual contraband. And then I asked myself a question: why? Why enforce this so brutally? If it was just a hypothesis, as they now admit, why teach it to millions of Catholics as a terrifying fact? The answer did not come from theology. It came from philosophy. I opened Baruch Spinoza, the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, published in 1670. Spinoza saw this exact mechanism. He saw it hundreds of years before the 2007 document was even drafted. Spinoza argued that religious doctrines are often human constructs designed by institutions to maintain authority and obedience, rather than eternal divine laws. He understood that when an institution claims to speak for God, it is very rarely speaking for God. It is speaking for its own survival. Spinoza warned us. He warned us that doctrines are made by men. When you read Spinoza, you realize that the entire concept of limbo was not a mistake. It was an exercise in institutional power. By controlling the geography of the afterlife, they controlled the behavior of the living. Think about it. The terror of limbo forced parents to baptize their children immediately, within hours of birth. It ensured that every new life was instantly registered into the institutional system. The fear was the enforcement mechanism. It was a brilliant, devastatingly effective policy. It guaranteed absolute compliance, and like all policies, it lasted exactly as long as it was useful. By the late 20th century, limbo was becoming a liability. It was terrible public relations in the modern world. People were no longer willing to accept the idea that an all-loving God would banish infants to the margins of eternity over a bureaucratic technicality. The doctrine was alienating people. It was no longer enforcing obedience. It was causing mass defection. Mothers were walking away from the church because the cruelty of the doctrine outweighed the comfort of the faith. So, the institution did what corporate institutions do when a product fails. They discontinued it. They updated the policy. If you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church published in 1992, limbo is simply not there. It was omitted entirely. Paragraph 1261 states that the Church can only entrust unbaptized children to the mercy of God. They just stopped talking about it. They erased it from the manual. But it was not enough. The question still lingered in the cultural memory. The trauma was still there, passed down through generations of families who still remembered the midnight burials. So, in 2007, they had to make it official. The International Theological Commission concluded there are serious theological grounds to hope unbaptized infants are saved. With those words, limbo was effectively archived, deleted. The honest truth is this channel does not make money anymore. YouTube demonetized it 2 months ago. If you want the work to continue, I wrote the books. 3 years of research, 5 volumes, every source verifiable. Not a donation, an archive. The link to the Spinoza archive library is in the pinned comment. If this research has meant something to you, that is where you can find more. I was reading that 2007 document again, very closely, and I realized something that made my blood run cold. The document does not apologize. It does not acknowledge the centuries of agony caused by the cillíní. It does not say, "We were wrong, and we are profoundly sorry for what we put your grandmothers and great-grandmothers through." It reads like a corporate memo updating a procedural guideline. It treats the afterlife like a zoning map that has just been redrawn by the planning committee. It is entirely sterile, completely devoid of human empathy. And this is where the loss of certainty really hits you. This is the price of looking into it. I would like to tell you that this is just one isolated mistake in history. I would like to tell you that everything else they teach is solid and eternal. But you do not unknow this. You do not unsee the machinery once the curtain has been pulled back. Once you see an entire realm of the afterlife deleted for public relations, you cannot look at any of their other doctrines the same way. If Limbo was just a theological hypothesis all along, why was it enforced with such brutality? And if they can delete Limbo, what else is just a hypothesis? What about their doctrines on marriage? What about their definitions of sin? What about their rules on who can love whom, or who is worthy of salvation? Are these eternal truths handed down from the divine? Or are they just medieval compromises waiting to be archived when they become unpopular enough to threaten the bottom line? I wanted to find a neat conclusion to this. I wanted to tell you that the truth is simple, that it is all just a lie, or that it is all true but they just made one error. But it is not simple. It is much more uncomfortable. Wait, let me rephrase that. Because saying it is uncomfortable is letting them off the hook. It is not just uncomfortable. It is a fundamental betrayal of trust. Wait, you know what really stays with me? It is the sheer scale of the silence. Think about how many women must have sat in those cold stone churches across Europe. Think about how many women must have looked up at those stained glass windows listening to a priest tell them in Latin that their child was forever separated from them. They were told that this separation was the will of a perfect, just God. And they believed it. They swallowed that grief. They internalized that horror because they were taught that questioning the church was the same as questioning God. That is what Spinoza understood better than anyone. In the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, Spinoza essentially strips away the mystical aura of religion and looks at it purely as a mechanism of social control. He saw that the most effective way to govern a population is not through physical force, but through fear and hope. If you can control what people fear in the next life and what they hope for in the next life, you control their actions in this life. Limbo was the perfect instrument for that. It was a manufactured fear. It created a problem that only the institution could solve. You have original sin. That is the problem. You are born broken. You are born unacceptable to God. And the only cure, the only way to fix that brokenness is the sacrament of baptism, which only the institution can provide. They held a monopoly on salvation, and if you did not get that sacrament in time, if your baby was born sick, or if the winter roads were impassable, or if the priest was delayed, the punishment was limbo. It was a system designed to ensure that the institution was the absolute indispensable center of every human life from the very first breath. And it worked. It worked for centuries. It worked so well that it created those cillíní, those midnight burials, those landscapes of hidden grief. It worked so well that people accepted the intolerable cruelty of it because the alternative was hell. But then, the world changed. The Enlightenment happened. The Industrial Revolution, the modern era. And slowly, the absolute monopoly began to crack. People started to ask questions. They started to wonder why a God of infinite love would act like a petty bureaucrat. The fear stopped working. And when the fear stops working, the institution has to adapt. That is what the 1992 Catechism was. It was an adaptation. It was a quiet retreat from a position that was no longer defensible. They did not announce it. They did not say, "We were wrong about Limbo." They just stopped mentioning it. They let it fade into the background, hoping people would forget. But people do not forget trauma that easily. The theology might change, but the cillíní are still there in the Irish countryside. The physical evidence of the doctrine is still etched into the landscape, so in 2007 they finally had to address it head on. The International Theological Commission had to put it in writing. And when you read that document, knowing the history, knowing the pain, the bureaucratic tone is just devastating. They concluded that Limbo was merely a theological hypothesis. A hypothesis. A hypothesis is something a scientist tests in a lab. It is an idea you float in a seminar room. It is not something you use to deny a mother the right to bury her child in a churchyard. It is not something you use to inflict generations of spiritual terror. If they had treated it as a hypothesis from the beginning, if they had said, "We are not sure, but we hope for the best," the history of Europe would look very different, but they did not. They presented it as an absolute certainty. They enforced it with the full weight of their authority, until they didn't. Think about the Council of Florence again, 1442. You have to really look at the men in that room. The absolute staggering arrogance it takes to sit at a table and decide the precise architecture of hell. To write a document that says officially that a baby is stained with a sin they did not commit and therefore must be exiled. And then to enforce that document on desperate populations. When you read Spinoza, you see how he dismantled this exact arrogance. In 1670, Spinoza argued that these men were not channeling the divine. They were channeling their own political anxieties. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus is basically a manual on how to decode religious terror. Spinoza saw that when an institution tells a mother her baby is in limbo, the institution is not delivering bad news from God. The institution is securing its own relevance. Because if the mother believes they have the power to define the afterlife, she will obey them in this life. It is the oldest trick in the Book of Power. Create a disease and then offer the only cure. The disease is original sin. The cure is the sacrament. And the punishment for not securing the cure in time is limbo. I was looking at the wording of the 2007 document again. The International Theological Commission. The very name sounds like a board of directors, and that is exactly what they are. They are a board of directors managing a brand. When the brand was strong, in the Middle Ages, they could afford to be brutal. They could afford to lock the cemetery gates and send men into the freezing rain to bury babies in the cillíní. Because they had a monopoly, there were no competitors. But in the 20th century, the monopoly broke. People started walking away. The brand was suffering. The brutality was no longer a sign of strength, it was a disaster. So the board of directors met and they drafted a memo. The hope of salvation for infants who die without being baptized. And just like that, the terrifying realm was archived. This is the loss of certainty I was talking about. You cannot go back. You cannot pretend that the men in robes are speaking for the universe. They are speaking for themselves. I keep coming back to the mothers. The generations of women who lived and died with that grief, they did not have the luxury of a theological commission revising the rules. They had to live with the terror. They had to wake up every morning and look out at the fields, knowing their child was buried somewhere in the dark, excluded from grace. And for what? For a hypothesis. For a bureaucratic compromise designed to fix a logical error made by men in 1442. When you realize that, the anger comes back. But it is a different kind of anger now. It is a cold, clear anger. The kind of anger that burns away the illusions. The kind of anger that Spinoza felt when they excommunicated him for daring to say that God is not a petty tyrant sitting on a cloud, writing rules about who gets into heaven and who goes to limbo. Spinoza said that God is nature. God is the substance of the universe. And the universe does not care about your theological commissions. The universe does not write memos. If there is a God, that God does not need a bureaucracy to distribute mercy. And if there is no God, then the bureaucracy is just an empty shell, a theater of power built on human fear. Either way, the institution loses its absolute authority. And that is why they deleted Limbo. Not because they found a new divine truth, but because they realized that if they pushed the fear too far, people would stop being afraid. People would just walk away. So they archived the myth, they updated the policy, and they expect us to just nod and accept it, to forget the centuries of trauma, to forget the cillíní, to forget that they built an empire on the terror of grieving parents. But we do not have to forget. We can read Spinoza. We can look at the documents. We can see the machinery for what it is. And we can choose to step out of the fear. It makes you think about how history is recorded. The documents that survive are the ones written by the people in power. The Council of Florence in 1442. The Tractatus in 1670. The Catechism in 1992. The Theological Commission in 2007. These are the texts that define the official narrative. But there is another history, an unwritten history. The history of the cillíní. Those unconsecrated burial grounds do not have official documents. They do not have theological commissions defending them. They just have stones, sometimes just small unmarked rocks piled up near a ruined wall. The people who buried those babies could not write theological treatises. They could not publish philosophical critiques. They just had to live with the consequences of the theories drafted in Rome. And that is perhaps the most profound injustice of all, the asymmetry of power. A theologian in 1442 writes a sentence, and a mother in 1850 spends her entire life weeping over a rock in a field. The theologian never sees the mother. The mother never meets the theologian. But her entire emotional life is dictated by his intellectual exercise. This is what Spinoza was trying to dismantle. He wanted to break the chain of command between the theologian's pen and the mother's grief. He wanted people to realize that the pen is just a pen. It is not a magic wand. It does not control the universe. And when you finally see that, when you finally understand that the power is an illusion, you do not just lose a doctrine, you lose the fear. And losing the fear is the first step to actually being free. I think about that mother in Ireland. I think about her a lot. She did not have the theological vocabulary to argue with the priest. She did not know what the Council of Florence was. All she knew was that the institution that claimed to represent God's love had just slammed the door of heaven in her dead child's face, and she had to accept it. She had to swallow the bile and walk back to her empty house, believing that this cruelty was somehow divine justice. Because if she rejected it, if she dared to say that God could not possibly be that cruel, she would be risking her own salvation. She was held hostage by her own faith. That is not religion. That is a hostage situation. And it took until 2007 for the hostage takers to admit that the gun they were holding was not even loaded. Before you go, a quick pause. This channel exists for this kind of conversation, the kind we rarely have out loud, the kind that sits in the back of your mind at 2 in the morning. Subscribing tells the algorithm that you want more of this because I have many more stories that refuse to let me go. So I am left with a question, and I really want to know what you think. When an institution quietly deletes a doctrine that caused centuries of pain, do we call that progress? Or do we call it a confession? Tell me if I am exaggerating down in the comments, because right now I am not so sure.
If you made it to the end, you're one of the few who really wants the truth. Write truth in the comments. It's how I know you're here for the right reasons, and it helps this reach others who need to hear it.